Hello and welcome to all to this webinar on Psychology in the Global South, Lessons from Democracy After Apartheid, which is hosted by APA Division 52 International Psychology. This webinar is part of the series titled Vision from the Global South, to celebrate the activities of psychologists that live in the Global South, to provide useful information for international engagement, and to encourage us to take a broad and global perspective. This webinar series has been founded by the International Grant Culturally Competent Counseling Vision from the Global South in partnership with the Division 17 Counseling Psychology. My name is Pina Marsic. I am the current president of Division 52, and together with Theo Lazarus, your host for today's webinar. I want to thank the members of the webinar committee, Dr. Theofilos Lazarus, the chair, Dr. Tatiana Elnour, and Raffaele Modugno. Before we begin, our online audience have the ability to ask questions by tapping them in the chat box located at the bottom left of your screen. Please feel free to type your question during the presentation. Dr. Elnour will be making note of them, organizing them, and during the last 12 minutes or so, she will present them to our speaker for discussion. I will leave the floor to Dr. Lazarus for introducing our guest speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pina. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Prof. Saths Cooper. I'm going to call him affectionately known as Saths by all of us in South Africa, in the psychology fraternity, and perhaps in the larger political fraternity as well. If I have to go through the history of transformation that he's ushered into South Africa, particularly in the psychological world, probably take me a whole webinar itself. But let me just say something from a personal note. We were a couple of years behind Saths at university, and we were merrily going about our science kind of courses, and he conscientized us to what psychology and what science should be in terms of transforming societies throughout the world. And for that, personal thanks to you, Saths, and I render that thanks on behalf of many others who were in our fraternity and who followed you through a period of time. Saths has been involved, and if you read his history, he has been incarcerated because of his challenge to the apartheid system in South Africa, and on being released, he wasted no time in transforming psychology, chairing the first Democratic Psychological Association in 1994, having celebrated our 30th anniversary in this year. And he brought about the changes, not only in applicability of the psychological services to South Africa, but challenging the generation of knowledge and bringing about the Global South into its right perspective. It's an ongoing challenge. And as we can see, Division 52, which is now called Global Psychology, Division of Global Psychology, will attempt to reach this in some ways. So Saths, over to you, and thank you for making yourself available.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I won't bother to correct some of the inaccuracies, but nevertheless, I'm pleased to share some thoughts with you because we have, all of us, come a long way in psychology, but there are hills still to climb. And I hope that by presenting you with my thoughts on this, we can jointly do what seems impossible, and that is to ensure that psychology worldwide is more accessible, is more inclusive, and reflects the conditions of all of us, not just a section of college-age students whose research gets extrapolated in the main in North American and Western European contexts to the rest of the world, but enables a psychology that is more even in its representation. I want to refer to the Cape Town Declaration, where certain statements were made, and this influenced the formation of the Pan-African Psychology Union, and in turn has helped psychology in various regions of the world, including Latin America, particularly Central America, and Asia Pacific, and the Middle East, which is a major source of daily war that we see on our screens in real time. And it tends to benumb us to the realities that we actually confront. The Cape Town Declaration was unanimously adopted by over 6,000 delegates to the International Congress of Psychology that was held in Cape Town from the 22nd of July till the end of that week. And it says for itself what psychology can be. That is an agent for change, clearly development of all human beings, and empowerment for both individuals as well as communities, and talks of the value of collaboration and cooperation. We held various meetings, and the Pan-African Psychology Union, PAPU, was formally inaugurated in September 2014. I'm pleased to say that the 10th anniversary Congress of PAPU was held together with the 30th anniversary Congress of the Psychology Society of South Africa in October this year. And President Andrew Zamani, who is from Nigeria, has taken the helm of PAPU. The vision is one of collaboration. We operate in a significantly different way to other bodies. The oldest regional formation is the European Federation, which comprises largely practitioners, but ours involves both scientists as well as practitioners, and our national members throughout the continent comprises both academics, researchers, as well as applied persons in the various categories of psychology. We also have initiated the Steve Biko Frantz Fanon Award for Psychological Liberation. For some of you, you recall that last week was the anniversary of Frantz Omar Fanon, who is a singular writer in the liberation of people from oppressive conditions. The first award was called the Steve Biko Award for Psychological Liberation, and on the same evening that the Pan-African Psychology Union was declared, the late Nobel laureate for peace, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, got that award. The second award went to Frantz Fanon, which was bestowed posthumously, and it was accepted by his daughter, Mireille Fanon Mendez, when PAPU was inaugurated in September 2014. It says, and the last award, the joint Steve Biko Frantz Fanon Award, was given to the entire legal team at the ICJ, who presented the case of genocide in Gaza and the quest for a common humanity. The PAPU board comprises people from throughout the continent, and these are reflected here. I won't waste time on this. I'll go to our national members, and you can see they come from across the continent, and we have a few more members pending who will be formally inducted next year. We have held leadership summits during the COVID pandemic. We held an online summit in March 2021, and these were the issues that emerged during that summit. The same issues that confront psychology in many parts of the world, particularly what we call the majority world, meaning the global south. Remember, this was the German Chancellor Scholz who initiated the term of global south, meaning the global north, largely the colonial part of the world, should be involved intimately in developing the global south. That has not come to be realized in any meaningful way. So the protection of the title of psychologist, which in many jurisdictions throughout the world is not legally protected, and the recognition and regulation of psychologists throughout the continent is a key aim of PAPU, and we are advanced in that. The relevance of psychology as a discipline, because in many countries, and many of you will confront that in the places that you work and live in, people say, well, what's the value of psychology? Because you can't eat it, unlike narrow economic needs. And yet we forget that without an understanding of psychology, the science of behavior, individual and comparative behavior across humanity and other primates in particular, we would not be able to do what we are doing, whether it's for good or evil out there. So the relevance of psychology as a discipline always has to be considered, particularly when we've got new threats from other disciplines. Social workers, they've been there. There are therapists, they've been there. There are pastoral psychologists, they've been there from time immemorial. Then there are behavioral economists and all sorts of other behavioral whatever-ist as a profession who would want to move into the terrain of psychology. The development of an ethical code is paramount, and that is starting in earnest during the second quarter of next year. And I'll deal with the challenges confronting us with these various matters, particularly portability throughout the continent. So the issue of strengthening psychology is very important because in most countries on the continent, the largest continent on Earth, despite what the unidimensional flat map has to tell us, that psychologists don't find favor in the third decade of the 21st century, when already in the late 19th century, psychology became an independent discipline. So the policy making psychology relevant to all walks of life, and importantly, impacting policy is perhaps what is more important than the number of psychologists around who can carry out these various tasks for implementation. Because you can train peer counselors, you can train counselors in community settings. You don't have to have necessarily a psychologist to do that, as long as there is a decision-making referral tree to psychologists who can supervise and oversee lower levels of psychology. The consequences of important events like the pandemic, which has not quite left us, because it's left a world that is more geopolitically challenged than ever before in the history of the planet, with more wars than we've had since the demise of the Second World War and the formation of the United Nations. The third aspect is decolonizing psychology. I'm not going to go into that in detail. It'll come out in the presentation, because that concept of decolonizing whatever we do seems to threaten certain groups of people, particularly organized psychology in some parts of the world, particularly the global north. So we did a survey where the results were represented in Addis Ababa in March this year. And these were the critical issues that psychology confronts on the continent, and not dissimilar to what we're finding in other regions of the world. As I mentioned, Asia Pacific, the Middle East, in Central America, and parts of Latin America. Membership, how do you retain? How do you engage? What should appropriate payment be? Formalization of membership structures, and how do you develop the association? What staffing is required? So as you can see, psychology is there in many countries where we have national associations, but they may not be represented fully in the academic or in the professional space, because there isn't that interplay between the theoretical to the applied. And I need to move my self, because there's an electric saving mechanism in the electricity, and resources. How do we resource an association? The recognition in all sectors of society and better engagement with government becomes very important. And in terms of public, the different publics, making psychology as visible in society, which needs a massive amount of creation of awareness, because the stigma of I don't need a psychologist because I'm not mad or crazy, I know words that usually we taught in first year not to use, but that's the effect in majority world settings. The expectations from our leadership summit were collaboration. How do we share knowledge? How do we really create partnerships based on equality and equity, even for a small country to hold its own with a very large country? How do we juxtapose a country like Lesotho, which is completely surrounded by South Africa, which has a very small number of psychologists that are postmasters, and Nigeria, which has the largest number of universities on the continent and the largest number of training programs in various areas of psychology. We give them equal status, 1 vote per country. How do we Africanize? How do we make psychology more indigenous in its various settings? Robert Roux, the president of the European Federation of Psychological Associations, EFPA, said in Istanbul in 2013, I think it was, or around there, or maybe 2011. He said, our psychology, meaning European psychology, is indigenous. It represents our condition in our country and the European condition at best. It does not purport to represent the rest of humanity. So all psychology ought to be situational, but in its teaching, you will find the colonial in the former British colonies, which tend to proliferate in large parts of the world, from South Asia through to North Africa and beyond. The remnants of narrow silos in psychology theory and its application still exist. The requirements for scientific writing tend to be subsumed by certain powerful interest groups, usually those who publish and who own publishing. So the issues of decolonization, if you like a broader Pan-Africanism, in the same way that you have an affinity with America and Canada in describing American psychology, particularly the English version of it, where Canada is bilingual. But that version persists versus a European version of psychology, bearing in mind that in Central Europe began the first experiences of delineating scientific psychology and its applications as we know it, and I'll deal with that very shortly. What assistance in managing and in establishing new associations, managing old ones, what kind of financial and other growth can we expect, and what relationship with government should we have? None of our associations are semi-government agencies. Not one of our national associations throughout the country, continent. Now, you can't say that for the rest of the world because there's a hand-in-fist connection between official psychology bodies and their national government, as well as their continental expression of it, like the European Union. So that we can truly say there's a more democratized psychology, if you like, in expression through the national associations and the vigorous protection of psychology against narrow political and partisan government interests. That perhaps is part of the difficulty of psychology finding more credence in those societies. But I'm proud to say that nearly all the countries that are members of the Pan-African Psychology Union are very clear about that remove from government involvement. We will involve ourselves with government, but we're highly critical of what government does in the name of the people. I don't have to explain to you the kinds of politics we've seen recently. This year has been a year of elections, bar none, throughout the world, and you've seen the outcomes. A retreat to narrow nationalism and inward looking. The issue of employment, how should psychology graduates be employed at various levels, and entrepreneurship in psychology beyond the Western narrow capitalist view of what is entrepreneurial. Student exchange, academic programs, scholarship, and the better preparation of students to confront a highly changed geopolitical and real environment in which technology has taken over, as you well know. So I'll come back to South Africa, the key events in South Africa. What's important to understand that until 1910, there was no South Africa. There was no entity called South Africa. It was only in 1910 when the two British colonies of the Cape and Natal and the two Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Free State had a war, and it ended in 2009, and an agreement was reached to unite and call this the Union of South Africa, excluding in that constitution blacks, all people who are not white. So when I use the term black, I'm saying all those who are not white, formerly called non-white. I have a particular position on that terminology, which is very demeaning. How can I call Pinya and non-South African? It doesn't describe Pinya. How can I describe Theo as a non-European? He's certainly not European. So the affirmation of a positive blackness is institutionalized in our country's constitution right now and various acts, even though we have various ethnicities, languages, religions, and political parties. In 1948, the elections then resulted in the formalization of apartheid. It was there through colonial times, with the advent in 1652 of Dutch settlement in what is now Cape Town, and the oldest living building in Southern Africa is the Castle of the Cape of Good Hope. It was built in the late 1650s into 1660s. With the advent of a formal apartheid, Afrikaans-dominated, Boer-dominated society, apartheid comes into being, further entrenching white minority rule. And you see significant events happening like 1960, where the anti-pass campaign resulted in over 100 persons being killed. The official narrative says 69, a stat from that period of March 1960, but records over the last 2 years show from morgue and other sources that the numbers were way above 100 shot in the back, mainly women, older people, and some children. This was because every person of ethnic African origin had to, once they hit the age of 16, carry on their person at all times, whether asleep or not, a so-called pass, a pass to be in a particular area. If you weren't in that area by law, their law, you would get arrested. And thus begins the growth of organized farming and servile, arrested people who were shipped out, farmed out to these farmers, which we have not come to grips with, despite celebrating democracy for 30 years in this country. The effect of the past laws the effects are profound, affecting family life, affecting economic and other issues. And as I say, we have not come to terms with that. The second major event was students in Soweto and other parts of the country, high school kids basically, in their pubescence and into their late teens, opposing the use of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction and the Soweto student uprisings erupting. Those were key events that led to Nelson Mandela being released in 1990, but 76 and its aftermath showed a trajectory for what we find in this democracy that we enjoy. History will tell us that these talks began probably in the mid-80s. That's not true. It began after 1976. I know this because I was imprisoned on Robben Island from 1976 through to 1982. And in 1978, there was going to be a release of Mandela and other Xhosa-speaking trialists who were with him in his Rivonia trial, which we stopped. We said, you can't be released to a tribal homeland because you represent more than that. The rest is history. Our first democratic elections were held from the 24th to the 27th of April, 1994. And before that, in January, in the third week of January, the Psychological Society was inaugurated in Cape Town, where the APA was also represented. Some key South African psychologists, Jan Smuts, who in 1895 wrote a psychobiography of Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman is a well-known writer in the US, and Jan Smuts, interestingly, was involved in the Boer War, but was close to the British and played a role and became the second prime minister of the country after the first person who was Botha became the prime minister in 1980. It was Jan Smuts who was also involved in the First World War. So he was in the League of Nations at that time when it was a small colonial bunch of countries. And then in the Second World War, very significant figure because he was Churchill's 2IC in the Second World War. And the United Nations is formed and he's there, but the Declaration of Human Rights proclamation was accepted during his tenure, but never adopted into law while he was prime minister and other things in South Africa. Wilcox was the first psychologist to establish at Stellenbosch University, where I hold a distinguished professorship. This was the advent of psychology was something that Wilcox did. The years are when Wilcox was involved in the leadership at Stellenbosch University. But in 1917, the first department of psychology was created at Stellenbosch University, and his student, Verwoerd, who was born in Holland, his father was a missionary in what was then Rhodesia, and his father moved to Brandfort in South Africa, still as a missionary, where Winnie Mandela was banished to in the mid-80s. He became the first professor of sociology. He did his PhD in one of the major universities in the UK. And because he returned with a postgrad, a PhD from Yale, he couldn't remain in Stellenbosch because he had more, at the Department of Psychology, because he had more credentials than Wilcox, and was allowed to form the first Department of Psychology and, Sociology and Social Work. Social work, very importantly, because he is renowned as the father of social work, which became a major competitor to psychology in South Africa from that time. He rose to become a prime minister in 1958, very bigoted. He was shot in 1961, survived that, and then killed in 1966 by an orderly in parliament. Very violent society that still remains violent even 30 years after democracy. Malherbe was principal of the University of Natal from 1945 to 1965. He was the head of intelligence during the Second World War under Jan Smuts. He founded the Council for Humanities Research and was the chief editor of the Carnegie Commission, instituted in 1928, on the poor white question, which Carnegie Foundation grant gave rise to Afrikaner capital in this country, without which things may have been slightly different. Simon Beshevel is also head of psychology at the University of Witwatersrand, popularly called WITS, and was head of the aptitude section in the South African Air Force and formed the National Institute for Personnel Research, which did research, racist research, into how can we have indigenous people doing the maximum amount of work with the least amount of water and nutrition, for example. Psychology and oppression, it's very clear that my colleague Shanaz Safla quote says it all, that organized psychology mimics the socio-political economic situation of the time. And so psychology as a profession and its representation organizationally as the South African Psychology Association at the time, which was formed soon after apartheid came into being, reflected ruling ideology, excluding the majority. But community psychology comes into its own in the 80s because there was a clear thrust to utilize psychological knowledge in democratic expressions and in anti-apartheid activities throughout the country in various formations that became political. And it adopted a change to what apartheid preached, both in terms of theory, but also in terms of praxis. Liberatory psychology, following soon after, entails serious empowerment, transformation, and the community activism in the quest for equity, justice, and change. So, as I pointed out, 3 months before South Africa's democracy, the the Psychological Society of South Africa was formed. And this signaled complete transformation of the discipline, not without cost, because many broke away. The old guard tended to break away, particularly in IO psychology. Here you see Desmond Tutu in 1995 crying because of the testimony that he had to hear as the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Interestingly, in the TRC, the only psychologists who made representation for victims were zero. Psychologists who made representations were for perpetrators. There was a significant case where my testimony was used, where certain people were sentenced to hang, but their sentences were commuted after my testimony for those who had been involved in anti-apartheid activities. Psychology's challenges we confront not only in South Africa, not only in the rest of the continent, but throughout the world, that our concepts are totally value-laden and tend to be largely West-centric. The relevance then for other contexts, even within Western situation, become serious. There isn't an interdisciplinarity and the ability to do what the first International Congress of Psychology did in 1889, which I'll come to shortly. Local, national factors interfere in the ability to create a psychology that can be equable, that can be applicable to all situations across the globe. You'll find that interventions, therefore, and indeed a large part of psychology, psychological tests, are inapplicable to the majority in our fragile world. The demographics we have in the majority world are rising student enrollment throughout Latin America, Africa, Asia Pacific, the Middle East, and so on. You have rising desires by young people to do psychology, but the uptake for those graduates isn't simply there. And that requires serious political change, policy and political change. Post-COVID, all the vulnerabilities were exposed, decoloniality came into its own, and various organizations began to call themselves global this, global that. I'm not challenging what you're calling yourselves as a global division of the APA, which I think is welcome, but there are a few out there who, particularly in Latin America, Asia Pacific, and I know for certain in Africa, people from the continent have called predatory. Psychology's achievements, particularly in the southern tip of Africa and moving across the continent, have tended therefore to be anti-racist and ethnicist, anti-sexist, and very important, anti-sectarian in political view in a national association. So that ethos underpins not only what we do in Africa, but increasingly what is becoming apparent in most of the majority world or global south. Strengthening the scientific underpinnings, because you can't strengthen that if you simply mimic what happens in Western classrooms and lecture halls to extrapolate those lessons to the rest of the world. You need to have real world research, which doesn't seem to happen. Psychology is a desirable profession. Unfortunately, it's been linked to medicine. That has been a boon for clinical and to some extent counseling psychology, but it has not managed to break the barriers. That bolder model that the APA looked at in the 1948 period is an imprisonment, if you like, of psychology and its immense possibilities. The national discourse in many of our countries includes psychology and well-being, particularly during and post the pandemic, and the levels of public trust have visibly grown. But simultaneously, the numbers of trained people with appropriate qualifications and certification hasn't happened. But the linkages with the regional bodies, cross-national, bilateral relationships, smaller regional roles, continental roles, and importantly, at the international level, where we impact various international bodies, particularly the International Union of Psychological Science, which probably now is facing its greatest challenges because of the geopolitics and the narrow nationalism and the war, or let me correct that, and the wars that seem to be happening, where most psychology fields are castrated in dealing with it. I'm sorry to use a sexist term there. It's important to look at human development indices, where 0.1 is regarded as very high, and the rest is regarded as fairly extrapolations of the ideal, which is 0.8 to 1.0. In May this year, the gross domestic product and purchasing power ratio of the 40 poorest countries showed that 31 are in Africa, and this excludes Sarawi. It does not include Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe will raise political noise, and the UNDP quickly removed Zimbabwe from it. So 78% of the poorest countries in terms of GDP purchasing power ratio exists in Africa. And in March this year, the UNDP said there's uneven development progress, intensifying inequality and polarization in all walks of life. That's repeated. So 1 in 5 persons live in acute multidimensional poverty, some 50% in Africa. I want to point to, last month was the anniversary of the start of the Berlin West Africa Conference, what's called the Congo River Basin Conference, which began the so-called scramble for Africa. Kaiser Wilhelm, no, not Kaiser Wilhelm, Bismarck forced all the Western countries listed here, and I include Russia as a Western country. Russia is only Eastern because of geopolitics, but it's European. And you can see that all of them have a human development index that is very high, that is from 0.8 to 1. And how is that possible if it weren't for retaining extractive holds on most of Africa, especially the Congo River Basin and Southern Africa, where nearly all the metals and rare metals and other requirements like lithium for environmental friendly and uranium production, etc., come from here. In Niger, for instance, where there's no national electricity, Paris enjoys electricity through what is harvested in Niger. So over 70% of the population in Africa live on less than $2 a day. Youth unemployment is exceedingly high, untenable. The levels of poverty, hunger, huge levels of disaffection, unemployment, violence, war, and importantly, hopeless leadership, self-serving, narcissistic leadership, open to corruption, living very well with bank accounts abroad from extractive economies, result in the collapse of government. So when you look at basket cases in the rest of, throughout the continent and other places, you should be looking at what did the global north and what does the global north still contribute to that state of affairs. We confront huge geopolitical dynamics. Technology has replaced human life and value. There's a rise in narrow, nationalistic, and bigoted thinking. Post-COVID, worsening socioeconomic conditions all over the globe. And how is it that at the height of COVID, 26 billionaires, US billionaires, were declared. That I leave to your imagination. So these threats pose real serious challenges to our psychological and physical well-being, and puts the whole future of humanity at stake. Now, the preamble to the Declaration of Human Rights, which I pointed out, Jan Smuts was part of the United Nations, but never bothered to adopt in this country, says exactly what it says here. All human beings are born free, equal in dignity and rights, but all over the world, this is not true. And even if you think that in some of the northern countries, this is true, think again. Why do you think people are leaving their countries for the West and across the Mediterranean, throwing children into rubber dinghies? That takes courage. And how are they treated? Like trash, human trash, and other words used, which I won't repeat here. The first getting together of international psychology happened in August 1889. It was the anniversary of the French Revolution. And so all the disciplines and sciences did something. This was the start of building the Tour Eiffel Tower was in its second level here in that time. And the center level was the restaurant where Wundt, Galton, father of eugenics, Charles Darwin's cousin, and the battle of the fittest, totally racist and coming apart at the seams. He believed that certain Europeans were the highest in intelligence and went down according to a color schema, ignoring that early human beings were actually very fair, had a lot of hair, and grew darker as they lost their hair, and it curled. He'd be curling in his grave if he knew the science that has been declared on this. Sigmund Freud was there. Can you imagine the conversations between some of them? Hugo Münsterberg from Poland, who said in answer to a question about the subconscious that it can be told in 3 words: there is none. Can you imagine he and Freud? He died at the lecture podium at Harvard. I hope I don't die giving you this presentation. Gilles de la Tourette, you know Tourette syndrome. Kosakov, Russian, the Russian Pinel, Binet, the first intelligence scale, Durkheim, the father of sociology, but he was a social psychologist. He was obsessed with religion, coming from a repressed French and Jewish background. So he and Freud probably had more in common than they cared to share. Wundt then is regarded as the founder of scientific psychology. And he was the first to call himself a psychologist. However, 150 years earlier, at the universities of Halle, Wittenberg, and Jena in Germany, this man, Antonius Guilhelmus Amo Affer, the first 2 names are Dutch and the last 2 are African. He preferred to use the entire name so that he embraced his Africanness, but his being transplanted at an early age, around 9, into the court in Holland. His was the first psychological dissertation called On the Absence of Sensation in the Human Mind. So the coloniality of knowledge production generally, and very specifically in psychology continues to be presented as if there was no psychology until Wundt discovered it. It's interesting that on the 31st of March last year, the current Roman Catholic Pope repudiated the edict on discovery that began in the 1400s with the Portuguese and then the Spanish conquering and claiming the New World, the Americas, as theirs for the Queen or King of Portugal and Spain, if they were heathen. The papacy has denied that people weren't living there. But we in psychology continue to think that a large part of the world were inhabited by cannibals and they just killed people and so on. I'm not being facetious, but if you scratch beneath the surface of some of the scholars that we fortunately don't have to confront much anymore, that kind of thinking still persists. But 135 years after the first International Congress, the issues confronting the Global South are not attractive issues. Big funders are not focused on funding research in the Global South. If they fund that research, it is through Western handlers. So you'll get a professor or two doing that research and then cajoling me and a few other younger people to be participants, and they make their history and so on from that. I'm not being facetious. The reality is not far from what I'm describing. We're really dealing with harsher realities than there are solutions that we can confront. And there aren't any easy, abracadabra and intractable problems from colonial times, from slavery, will immediately disappear. COVID has ensured that the intractability of some conditions remain. So psychology is a core discipline and ought to inform all areas of human engagement, but does it? It doesn't. We need to become interpreters of our own conditions and shaping society, managing how we engage in our spaces, away from narratives that actually are becoming more rarefied and unsustainable. Rich, indigenous, cultural, and other experience is therefore being denied the global north if you look at it through narrow European American or American European eyes. Clear agenda settings so that there can be equity between researcher, the head of the research, whoever he engages with or she engages with, and the rest, including subject, who we go through motions of saying we will do X, Y, Z, but we hardly provide that feedback, even in northern and global settings. We need to determine the terms together, not allow engagement by a few, because critical insight will be lost. We need strong national associations, but there needs to be interdependence beyond my becoming president of whatever, beyond my CV and beyond. Those are important, but they should not become the be-all and end-all of the publish or perish myth that seems to plague Western science and its applications in all disciplines. We need activities for mutual benefit. Yes, the individual will benefit, the country will benefit, the region, the continent, and of course, all of the globe will benefit if we do this together. So where are we going? Can we rise above the marks of our origin? Can we subject ourselves to objective reality, not only look through our own narrow spectacle, like I'm probably doing now? Going into an experiential base that we ask those we engage with to describe, rather than putting onto them a framework of what we think they are about and what we think is what makes them tick. So we have to contribute. We have no option to contribute to a relevant psychology, that's really informed by global experiences, not convenient narratives. I've spoken for a long time now and I need to end, so I'm going to leave you with this thought that 94 to 96% of the world's population can trace their DNA to the oldest living ethnic group in the world, the Kumani San in the southern Kalahari or Kalahari Desert, which forms the cradle of humanity between the Western Cape and the Horn of Africa. And as Shakespeare said in Julius Caesar, that sometimes we are master of our fate, but the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we remain underling. There's an epistemic violence in our language, the language we use, and perhaps some of the words I've used are reflective of a reaction to that. And the dominant narrative needs to be challenged because it does not represent the majority in our society. I believe that psychology should serve all. It's an agent of conscientization, and we cannot be bystanders when our world is deteriorating at such a fast pace. We have to claim our common humanity and contribute meaningfully in the quest for a psychology that is truly universal. We must do this without fear, favor, prejudice, and Pasteur said, the future belongs to those who have done most for suffering humanity. I believe that if people don't have a need for psychology, psychology will die. It will be overtaken by social work, the economic behaviorists, and others. We must serve and can serve all of humanity, not just an elite. These are the consequences that we confront with the negativistic approach that seems to be apparent in our psychology currently. How we treat the worst of amongst us underpins our claim to being human. We must protect our fragile world to change. I want to thank you and stop there. I've overdone my time limit.
Thank you very much, Professor Cooper. What an amazing insights that you provided. And we do have a couple of questions coming up. One of our participants, Kossi, is asking, what do you think about the US and European countries who have been taking African resources in regard to supposed poverty in Africa?
Look, I think that those companies, you know, the tragic assassination of the CEO of United Health in New York about a week ago actually epitomizes what's been happening. If you read some of the reactions of the clients of United Health, it's almost as if there's a celebration of death. How does this happen? In the heart of capital, the New York Stock Exchanges tend to have most of the world's capital in it. And when United Health is in that situation, and young people and older people, reflected by their social media postings, say that this kind of exploitation shouldn't persist. So what there should be, especially the Securities and SEC in New York, Washington, that access, they need to be checking. If I'm a leader in my country, or I hold some other public position, what am I extracting from my country and putting into the financial services groups in Europe and in North America? And how am I hiding that? That surely is money laundering, and it's extractive. So if, you know, after the Second World War and the Holocaust, and still today, there are people who chase Swiss banks for lost works of art and so on in Central Europe. If the Swiss banks can take a lead in saying, Cyril Ramaphosa has an account in X bank, Saths Cooper has an account in Y Bank. I think we'll change that. That you cannot look at human rights as something convenient, where HTS is lauded in Syria. Al-Qaeda changing its name. And then we're going to be looking at another Afghanistan. I think that somewhere we've lost our principle for outcomes that we will find very terrible to confront. I mean, you know, if you know the civilization that's there in Syria and other countries, which UNESCO and others were trying to protect for decades now, and now it's come to pass that that situation. I'm not excusing Assad. I don't believe in war. I don't believe in imprisonment. Obviously, I've been a prisoner myself. But I mean, if you kill somebody, you should be in prison. But are we putting our leadership on trial? We're not. And our leadership should know that they cannot commit these errors at the expense of ordinary people whom they take for granted. And yes, I think, Tony, I'm answering some of the big issues that we can probably agitate for together, because we know, many of us on this platform and elsewhere, that if we stand together as key actors in this discipline that we represent and are part of, we can expose in a decent way some of these realities and take it from there. We should not be defending our psychology. We should not be defending our psychology for paying lip service at an international level, but then doing everything to oppress people wherever they are, or turn a blind eye and deaf ear to it. Again, I'm sorry for the impolitic language. The impacts, Kosi, are severe because, you know, there's enough research done, and it's old research. When you finish your PhD, you're regarded as, you know, you've lost control over what you do because everything has been taken out of you, and you have to find your own feet again. Can you imagine? And you, from your name, clearly are from that context. When your own selfness and own location gets impacted in the classroom, and you are forced to comply with the norm, which tends to be what's normative in most countries' classrooms. If there's a foreign student, if there's somebody else, or in the American context, a minority from somewhere, and from the country itself, you get othered very seriously. And we need to overcome that. One, we need, my view is, those who are whites amongst us, you can stand up and raise this. Don't wait for the fragility of being white to be published. Each of us should be standing up against some of these practices, whether it's racism, whether it's othering, whether it's sexism, and so on, so that those that we think are not fit enough and are not equal to the task in those classrooms, particularly if they're graduate school classrooms, can feel a solidarity.
Fabulous, amazing insights. We don't really have any other questions in the Q&A. I don't know if Theo or Pina, would you like to have any questions or last thoughts?
Well, of course, I have a lot of questions. Theo, can I? I would like to have some more thoughts on one of the points among many is that resonates a lot with me. As a developmental psychologist, you and very much interested in educational issues, and I'm very sensitive to this the colonial perspective. If I got correctly, your thoughts, your ideas is that all psychology is indigenous, but it might be colonial in the teaching. Is that correct? Would you elaborate further?
Well, look, it's very natural I'm using the word deliberately, for anybody who is invested in her pursuit to use herself and her immediate context to do work, and especially the research. So there's almost a self-selecting bias in that, and there's nothing wrong with it. When that is extrapolated to large tracts of the globe, you realize how it actually seriously doesn't fit. The International Union of Psychological Science, before I came onto their executive in 2000, spent a lot of time on exactly this, and it was led by cross-cultural psychologists. It was led by leading developmental psychologists from Turkey, from parts of Africa and the East. And they did some important work, and that's where the term majority world emerged. Çiğdem Kashitsibatsi from Turkey, bless her soul, was the one who very clearly used the term majority world. And you know, they say dynamite comes in small packages, and she was a small woman, but very powerful. She took no prisoners, and she simply made anyone who, whether they were a native Turkey like herself or from elsewhere, hear her views. And there are other ways to do the same kind of thing. When I quoted Robert Rue, 2011, he was expressing a truism that we do it looking at our own context. But we don't always acknowledge it. We almost seem to want to say, my research is generalizable to all conditions and all contexts, wherever they may be. And all of us know that's a BS, and it shouldn't be happening. So there needs to be opening of spaces by those of us who are in leadership in the academy, as well as in other spaces, so that nobody's interpretation is ignored, because we do that at our own peril. And many of us who have been in those kinds of spaces, I think we need to empathize with bright, bushy-tailed, smarter than us young people who can really show the way. Otherwise, we end up like an Afrikaner judge who sentenced me to the longest imprisonment I served, said the Afrikaans definition of a preacher, he used the word predikant, is show the way, but don't go there yourself. We can't, none of us can afford to do that. We must show the way and be prepared to go there ourselves. It's not easy. It's going to muddy the waters. It's going to muddy our clothes, but we need to do that. And the context in which we do that has to be one where Kosi finds solace in how things are taught, that teaching is using a particular example. It shouldn't make anybody feel inferior, that their contexts are just being ignored. And nearly all of us, in some way or the other, have felt it during our undergraduate and then graduate school training. And in some ways, we need to introduce the reality that actually I come from a different context, and this is what that context is about, so that that professor is open to your experience and your identity and how you look at yourself, and in that context of just taking certain teachings and wanting to generalize it to the rest of the world. Very interestingly, the majority of work now done on decolonization comes from North America, and I don't include Mexico in that. So it's saying that from a resistance of over a decade ago, now people see a new opportunity but let it not be a false one, because those who enter that space merely because they want to make a name for themselves or publish the next text that is prescribed will destroy that attempt to truly understand all of humanity using everyone's insight where we can. At the same time, you shouldn't, in any context, be teaching or doing application for others when you start at home. So it may be contradictory in what I'm saying, but I'm saying you need to teach what's appropriate for the class that you're dealing with. The applications also need to deal with that at an average level, but then go to the specifics where those can be, those few can be discriminated against, and deal with that as an example as well, because you cannot afford to just deal with your own interests and your own version of what reality is. I would be remiss in presenting to you a psychology that is entirely Black consciousness and puts out the teachings of Fanon and Biko and others without looking at where those people I'm engaging with are from. So it takes a lot to subdue your own need and teach for the class that you are engaging. Otherwise, you lose people, you antagonize people, and you create and entrench a narrow bigotry that represents itself as saving our country, and we don't want this kind of person or that kind of person in our country. And it's not only Trump that's doing that. In many parts of the world now, that has become the leitmotif, and we should be working against that. I'm looking at Gulzar Ahmed's point. Oh yes, we can definitely teach some of that, Dr. Ahmed, that psychologists should be looking at. And I think cooperative teaching is the way to go. I mentioned interdisciplinarity, but I don't think we can do that without looking at colleagues from whichever aspect of humanity in its rich diversity they come from. So if we exclude, for whatever reason, narrow Pan-Africanist, or the term that's often used in Western context, Islamist, or whatever else, and with the rise of India now, there's a narrow nationalism of Hindutva. People want to support and be close to who appears to be on the news, in social media, prayed to, fawned over. Humanity is not like that. I want to leave you with one example. When the tsunami happened, and probably some of you weren't around then, in 2024, at the end of 2024, in South and Southeast Asia, the International Union said, we need to do some interventions. The APA suggested somebody for it. At the time, he was the leading person in post-traumatic stress interventions. And he did workshops. In 2004, in 2005, some of the findings were presented in Bangkok, it was. And what was interesting was that there were participants there who raised the question. Yes, they had this great teacher, but the context that he was talking about was totally foreign to them. And I remember asking a question. And the result is that person has started what's called psychological first aid. He is the pioneer in psychological first aid. Jerry is a great teacher because he took in things that were raised and incorporated it in his own conceptualization of its theoretical and applied bases. So that, I think, is what we should be doing. Or when you're challenged and you have a good reason to defend yourself, by all means, hold your position and defend yourself. Don't kowtow to the loudest person challenging you. And so that may appear to be contradictory, but I think you get my drift on that.
Thank you very much. I think I will just take let's say 1 minute to the stage for thanking Dr. Cooper for such an incredible talk, which gives also some idea for future action as a sort of manifesto for the future. Thanks a lot. And on behalf of International Division 52, they're now changing the name, and we are Society for a Global Psychology, which after a while, we finally get this changing done. Thanks a lot. I will leave the floor to Tatiana and to Theo for the final words, but on my behalf, as a president of the Vision, I would thank you, all the participants, the people that have been worked so hard over the years for this entire webinar series that has been, so challenging for some reasons, and so it's also so innovative because we brought here people from the global south to discuss a lot of topics. And Dr. Cooper has just finished this series of webinars with one of the the most interesting and the most fabulous one. Thanks a lot. Lots of hope from your speech, and we will continue on this way. Thanks a lot.
Before Tatiana says anything and closes up, I just want to say thank you, Saths, for that really good, succinct expose of psychology and the challenges we face. The challenges have not diminished. In fact, they're getting greater, and reminding us that we should always be reminded that we are human beings first, and everyone's humanity needs to come first. And they need to be considered within their context and within their humanity. Thanks for that. And it's strange that what you've been talking about and all the series that we've presented so far, a lot of that has tended to work in that way. And looking forward to the webinar series continuing next year and re-inviting you back onto expanding on some of the issues raised, and of course, other people from around the world. Thanks again. Tatiana?
Thank you very much, Theo and Pina, and also Professor Cooper and colleagues who have been in attendance. We just want to flag that the webinar is recorded and the recording will be available on our website. You can use the division div52.net and you can /webinar and you can access all the webinars for our global series for 2024. And while it's sad to say goodbye, we really thank you for all your dedication and commitment, and we look forward to receiving your feedback and also to welcoming you to other series next year. Thank you very much.
And I want to thank you for having me and also support your name change unconditionally. I think it's a good name change, and I think it can work. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.